Hello and welcome to the Real Bible Rub podcast. Today I'd like to speak about one of my favorite topics of all, and that is I love the history of science. I can't get enough of it. And as a pastor, especially a little bit later in life, I've been able to understand how much there's an interplay between science and religion. This has been going on for a really long time. Newton was very religious, and in fact, as I will describe here, his sort of Calvinist views, his Protestant views, really informed him and helped him in developing calculus, gravity, optics, all of the amazing things that Newton did. And then I'll skip forward a couple centuries to Darwin, to two centuries to Darwin, who also was a religious guy, not as much as Newton, but he kind of broke a little bit what Newton used so much, and that was the idea of determinism, basically the heart of the Enlightenment. And I'll kind of contrast those a little bit. Then I'll talk a little bit about Einstein, because Einstein was more like Newton than he was like Darwin, and he struggled mightily with the idea of determinism and how you should see the world. So when you see how these guys dealt with the world, you can really see kind of the philosophical struggles that we go through. And I'll bring up a couple of verses, Ephesians 1:11 and Jeremiah 10:23, that people often use for this idea of determinism or the absolute control of God over the universe. So let's get started. First of all, I'll start with a little bit of philosophy about and history about Newton. So Neil deGrasse Tyson was recently asked, who's the best scientist or who's the most amazing scientific mind ever? And Tyson said, without a doubt, he goes, there is no contest, and that's Isaac Newton. And it surprised the host when he asked that, but Tyson explained it in a way that I think helps a lot. He goes, not only did he develop the theory or the laws of motion and gravity, but he had to develop calculus in order to do that. And not only did he do that, but he also was instrumental in developing optics and the idea that white light was a mixture of many colored lights and how many colors of light and how these come together. So, and he did all of this by age 26, I think, something like that. So he obviously had a very fertile mind. But when you look at a little deeper, where did he get his philosophy? Where did he really begin that kernel of understanding that would then drive his scientific discovery? And actually, it was religion. It was this idea of absolute control, absolute sovereignty, which was very much in fashion in the 17th century. This is also the time when we get the Canons of Dort, the Belgic Confession, then we get the Westminster Confession of Faith in the mid-century. At the end of the century, we got the London Confession for the Baptists, and all of these are very steeped in Calvinist thought. And you go, well, why is that so important? Well, because Calvin was the first one to really meld this idea of the universe, of control. We were just starting to get out of the idea of the Earth being the center of the universe. The geocentric universe. By the time of Calvin and certainly by the time of Galileo, who basically proved it, Copernicus's ideas of a heliocentric universe had already been in place. The other thing that happened is Galileo did a lot of discussion or a lot of studies on falling bodies, determined that the inverse squared law, he was the one that basically showed the inverse squared law, and that falling bodies were independent of their density, would fall at the same rate, independent of their weight. And then another key person in this period was Johannes Kepler. And Kepler was the one that discovered that the orbits of the planets, this is after it's already been determined that the sun is at the center of the universe as they know it, basically the solar system. And it was Kepler that figured out, well, these planets, they don't go on circular orbits at all. They're on elliptical orbits. And this is very important because if you know that planets are going around in an ellipse, the only way that happens is by the inverse squared law. So where does Newton come into this? Well, he had a very firm Calvinist view that God controls every action in the universe. So it was his observation of a falling apple. We don't know if it was a falling apple, but falling objects here on Earth follow the inverse squared law. And then Johannes Kepler determined that ellipses, or that planets go in ellipses. So Newton takes the fact that he thinks that God's controlling, not only apples falling here and us here on Earth, but is also controlling things that are happening in the heavens very, very far away. They already knew that, the sky isn't just a dome. No, that these planets are very, very far away, and really have nothing to do with Earth itself. So it was Newton that took that and integrated those ideas, his Calvinist ideas, with Kepler, with Galileo, and then he just said, obviously, if that applies out in the universe, it applies here. There is a sort of a universal understanding of science. So he was able to do that, and he was able to do that also believing that everything was determined. Newton is the height of determinism. Determinism is the idea that if you know all of the inputs of a system and you know all of the processes of a system, then you can predict all of the outcomes. So Newton was spectacularly successful at doing this. He, using mathematics, using calculus that he basically developed, was able to show that you could predict the motion of an object with great precision. Because you know the inputs and the process that they go through is basically gravitation, and you can do that. It was so successful that this is how we put humans on the moon. This is how we put satellites into space. This is how satellites could go and intercept Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus and Neptune and Pluto and everything, is Newtonian mechanics. You needed nothing else than that. So this young man in 1660s comes up with this, and he is able to pull these ideas together. It's not actually it's a good object lesson in how any great scientist does this, or how any great improvement in thought happens. It happens basically because you are able to integrate ideas that are already out there into something that makes sense. Einstein did this as well. Einstein knew there was a problem with Newtonian mechanics in that it didn't always work, especially under extreme gravity situations. That also that it also didn't fit what was about Mercury. The planet of Mercury didn't exactly fit, and they didn't know why. They also I I should say, Einstein knew about James Maxwell Clerk, who also had the equations of light, Maxwell's theories, and electromagnetism. So he was able to put all of these ideas together, including the falling of that the motion and the feeling you have in a falling elevator is going to be the same as it is to be under gravity. So he was able to also take these different ideas and then generalize them and then put them into a theory. And that's exactly what Newton did. So Einstein is very interesting as well, because here we are in the early 20th century, and Einstein is a determinist. He absolutely was committed to determinism. He did not believe in probabilistic input or randomness. He believed in this, and this is his famous thing about God doesn't play dice comment when he was talking about quantum mechanics, is that he was determined to do that. But he struggled with it because there was all this evidence out there that determinism is falling apart, that you can't predict everything. So then this brings us to Darwin and why Darwin created such a problem. With the Enlightenment, with religious figures, especially in Protestantism, once the controversy over Galileo was over with the Catholic Church, and once they had a heliocentric universe as part of their philosophy in the Catholic Church, the Protestants, fully embraced that as well. Protestants fully embraced the ideas of the Enlightenment. Protestantism, as we know it, is really a product of the Enlightenment. It actually kicked off the Enlightenment to a large extent with the Protestant Reformation, and then fully embraced the Enlightenment as it progressed. So like I said, by the time you get to Newton, that is the high point, the absolute triumph of determinism and the Enlightenment. Things start falling apart, though, over the next couple of centuries, little by little. Sometimes they're starting to figure out, they could never figure out what gravity really was, for example. Newton knew that. Newton knew about the spooky action of gravity that Einstein would talk about. He knew that. But and then there were starting to be some cracks in there, especially when you started to get more scientific discoveries that didn't always hold up to determinism, weren't always predictable, but people still remained very, very committed to it. Darwin is more than just the father of evolutionary theory. It is more fundamental than just the evolution and the origin of the species. What he's saying is that at the very heart of the species, very heart of biology, is this notion of randomness, and that it requires randomness in order to, you have to have random changes in order that you can have natural selection. This was earth-shattering. People didn't, first of all, it was very controversial because it basically says God doesn't control everything, number one. It says, in addition to the fact that whether, humans evolved from apes and whether, all life evolved from something else, that was also controversial because it seems to be like in direct conflict with Scripture. But that's not really at the heart of the discomfort. Even today, what's at the heart of the discomfort is the fact that God doesn't control everything. Because if God had absolute control over everything, then the idea of an evolutionary process that you don't know the outcome, you can't know the outcome of an evolutionary process, even if you know all of the inputs. That was the first big major crack in determinism. And of course, Darwin didn't know this. And of course, the people in the mid-19th century really were still very committed to determinism and didn't understand that this would be as monumental as it was. That's something that people don't really grasp, is they think of Darwin just being about biology, but really fundamentally he biology is just one aspect of this idea that random inputs through the process of selection give a result. So you can't predict the result. Now, this became more obvious, and it was thought, well, okay, well, biology's different, right? And became more obvious as when in chemistry and especially in physics, we started understanding, with quantum theory especially, that this is true as a basic fundamental thing about nature. Um, Werner Heisenberg in the early 20th century was the one that took these to the very next step in saying that, and the uncertainty principle. It started with Max Planck, and Max Planck discovering quantized things and coming up with Planck's constant, which is the very smallest division you can have, and then you can move that. Werner Heisenberg comes and says, oh, well, using Planck's constant, you can't know the exact position and momentum at the same time of anything, of any particle. Now, of course, at our macro level right now, yes, we can know with great precision. But when you get down to very tiny things and you look at that it is inherent in nature. And it took, almost all of the 20th century. It took until the 60s to be actually proved. And this is why Einstein was so uncomfortable with this, because a committed determinist, that's how he did his thing. That's how he learned. That's how he theorized. So when faced with quantum mechanics, he had a big problem with it because it blows a hole in determinism inherently. And as you go through the 20th century, and he had his discussions with Niels Bohr and the shape of an atom and all of that stuff. But also as you go later in the 20th century, it was found in mathematics, even without any physical processes, the idea of chaos, and that nonlinear equations can create chaotic outcomes. This is the idea of chaos theory, and the Mandelbrot set and fractals and all of those things. All of those things show that randomness is fundamental in nature. Absolutely. It's not only in biology, it's not only in chemistry, but it's also in fundamental particles and even in our mathematics, completely disconnected from physical processes. So you can see that, wow, well, if God created the universe, then certainly God must have created the universe in a way that can't be controlled. Created the universe in a way that the outcome can't be predicted. Now, there's lots of philosophical ways you can deal with this. You can say, well, God knows all outcomes, and that every outcome can go to something or another, and that's fine. But the thing is that the classical idea of divine determinism is completely just unsupported. And I mentioned in an earlier podcast about John Stuart Bell, who in 1964 was, and there's Bell's theorem and all of that comes out of some of Einstein's work. And he basically proved in 1964 that no, determinism is a fallacy. It just doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in nature at all. So here we have this idea that God can't control everything in the way that we think. So, is there some sort of mystical, bigger thing that we don't understand? Well, maybe that's true. I don't know. Nobody knows. But the thing is that for the physical processes that we live with, probability randomness, and chaos are just built in, and it's built in at the most fundamental level. So what kind of God is this? So the thing that makes people so upset, honestly, when you really probe down to it, is not necessarily that humans evolved from apes. It's not necessarily that that science challenges people in their religion and so forth. No, it's this idea of control. That how can we have a God that doesn't control everything, especially in our Calvinist way? It's such a fundamental part of the way we see things. I've mentioned R.C. Sproul in the past. He's the one that says, if there's one molecule in the universe, anywhere in the universe, that's running around without God's sovereignty, then you can't be sure of anything, right? You can't be sure of the saving grace of God or Jesus, which I think is just a stupendously arrogant thing to say. I mean, come on. Instead of talking about absolute control, we really should be talking about where does God fit and how does God work without absolute control. That's a completely other discussion, but the idea comes from how do we approach the scriptures that show that or seem to indicate that God's in complete control. And then how do we deal with that? And how do we deal that with the faith thing? How do we get out of this idea that there's science over here and that there's faith and God over here, and that God is divorced from the physical universe and that the physical universe is something different? We do that for just to maintain our feelings of control and our feelings of what religion should be rather than reality. So how do we get reality and faith back together? A lot of people just say, well, that faith doesn't matter. Well, I think that's also fallacious too, because faith does matter. That's what motivates people. That's where people have a spiritual sense. God exists just because people say God exists, just like love exists because people say love exists. Any one of a number of philosophical ideas exists, just because we say it does, getting back to Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am, right? So this is important. So let's talk about Ephesians 1:11. It says, in Christ we have also obtained an inheritance, having been destined according to the purpose of him who accomplishes all things according to his counsel and will. Now, what are we talking about here? Is this a scientific prediction? Is this predestination? Certainly this verse, certainly Ephesians 2:8, for example, have been used to push this idea of absolute control, predestination, and so forth. And the usual arguments are, well, if there's absolute, double predestination, there's the elect and there's the reprobate and all of that stuff, then how do you have free will? And then there's all kinds of backflips you can do to integrate those ideas with free will. I think what they're doing is they're asking this verse to carry a lot of weight, that when you look at in context, even 2:8 in context, these are words of comfort, right? These are words of God and Christ. Christ is worth trusting. God is worth putting your trust in. In context too, this is to the Ephesians who had the cult of Artemis and had the pagan gods, and saying, well, you can put your trust in Jesus. You've already put your trust in other gods. Well, maybe you should place your trust in the God of the Israelites and in Jesus Christ. That's what the message is here. So this idea of we inherit because we have been taught these things, and having been destined according to the purpose of him, well, all we're saying is that God has a purpose, that God has a desire. That's all that really means. It doesn't carry the weight of a describing a fundamental aspect of the universe, like people try to do with it. And you'll find that every scripture that's used for predestination or divine determinism has the same problem, is that something that was written for the purpose of either comforting people, giving people a basis, giving people a support in the law, or to build community, has been picked up and then turned into something that describes the universe and laws of science. You also have to remember that at this time, these people, when they wrote it, they had no concept of the idea of cosmology. They had no idea that the stars were, thousands, millions, billions of light years away. They had no idea that of the processes in the heavens. They had no idea how small we are and where we are in the universe. So, to ask them and what they wrote to be predictive of what we deal with, they had no idea of science. It's crazy. What we're doing is we're taking ancient texts, we're lifting them for our purposes. That's the epitome of eisegesis. I'll always say eisegesis by itself isn't bad necessarily, but when it's used like this to say, well, that's what God meant, that's just a fallacy. The other one is Jeremiah 10:23, another verse of the many that is used for this purpose. And it says, I know, O Lord, this is Jeremiah speaking, that the ways of humans is not in their control, that mortals, as they walk, cannot direct their steps. What this means in the way it's used and what Jeremiah meant are two different things too. Basically, Jeremiah just says we don't control our destiny, our fate, what happens to us. Things happen to us randomly. We put our hope in a God that we believe does have control in order to give us comfort. Well, maybe God does have control. Certainly, we believe that God has influence. We believe that God listens to us. But we also realize that we, moving in time, and many people say, well, God's out of time. Maybe that's how God exercises control, because God has predictive powers that we don't have. Okay, that's fine. That's a good thing. You can do that. But to say that, to use Scripture in this way of an all-controlling God that predestines everything is not what the Scriptures were written for, and not what we can get. If we want to have a faith that lives that is rational, that is part of, that embraces the things that we learn from science and reality and observation, then we have to be able to say, maybe the way these verses are used, maybe the way the ancient people wrote about these things, informs us, gives us life, gives us encouragement, guides us, but is not predictive of everything that we learn today. And that will be true in the future, too. There are many things that we know today that will be challenged, changed, and understood different. But the one thing that won't is that we know that randomness, chaos, and the system, the processes of nature are not deterministic. We know that. There is zero evidence that we'll ever go back on that. It's kind of like gravity. We know gravity exists because we experience it all the time. Every prediction of gravity has turned out to be true. Every prediction, it's a fact. Determinism is the same way. It's basically a fact because every prediction of it has been shown that you can't determine all outcomes with all inputs and all processes understood. It's just a fundamental in nature. So I think that really can help us. How do we, as religious people, how do we have science? How do we have understanding? How do we have all of the things that we've learned over time? And how do we integrate it into our faith? That's why I think going back and looking at the history of science, looking at these people that have done all this great work, and even more recently, all the great work that's been done in biology and genetics and all of that. There are a lot of people in that who, who are faithful. There are a lot of Christians in science. It's not as much as in the general public, because the general public tends to look at religion a little bit differently than many people of science do. But the thing is that I have absolutely no problem with my good, solid understanding of science and my good, solid understanding of religion, and having them be completely compatible and working together. I think that if you try not so hard to make God a God of control, instead be curious and open-minded and see how, there's this dance between faith and evidence. There's this dance between belief and science. There's this dance that goes on. Now you can cut off all the belief stuff and everything and just be, an atheistic scientist. You can also do the other thing, and many, many people do it. They're anti-intellectual. They throw away all science except for the stuff that, seems obvious to them. And they just believe in God number one, right? And only their faith. You can do those things. But I think that that leads to a lot of problems. It leads to a lot of fallacies, and it leads to ignoring the great richness of life. And the great richness of life comes both in evidence and science and in faith and spirituality. I'm just firmly believe that. So with all of that, I'll say that people do say a lot of things about the Bible that aren't really there. They say the Bible is a science book when it really isn't. And people who, ignore the Bible say, well, you don't need the Bible. But guess what? The Bible and people's religious beliefs have always guided people to ideas about nature and understanding the world. So with that, I say, God bless you.